So there is a little video about the heart tube, its subdivisions, and how they are converted into the adult heart structure. So first you can see that in the atrial end of the heart tube, which constitutes till the this primitive ventricle, and this primitive ventricle is separated from the primitive atrium by an atrioventricular groove. So this atrioventricular groove separates the ventricle from the atrium. Below is the venous end of the heart tube. So first let's see the uppermost aspect of this heart tube. This entire portion till here is called as the bulbus cordis, and as you can see, this bulbus cordis can be divided into three portions. The upper 1/3 is called as the truncus arteriosus, and as the name implies that the truncus arteriosus is a structure which is going to be converted into the arterial trunk. This is the structure which will form the outflow tracts of the heart, and those outflow tracts of the heart will emerge from the outflow chambers of the heart, that is the ventricles. And there are two outflow tracts of the heart, the pulmonary artery and the aorta. The middle portion is called as the conus, whereas the proximal 1/3 is the bulbus cordis. This bulbus cordis is separated from the one ventricle by another sulcus, which is called as the bulboventricular sulcus. So what happens is that, as I have told you, that the upper 1/3 will be converted into ascending aorta and pulmonary trunk. The middle one will form outflow tract of right and left ventricles, that is the ascending aorta and the pulmonary trunk, their initial portions. And the lowermost part will form the primitive right ventricle, but its trabeculated form. You should remember that this proximal 1/3 portion of the bulbus cordis will merge with this ventricle, the primitive ventricle, and together they will form a loop which will be called as the bulboventricular loop. This bulboventricular loop will form the ventricles of the heart. The proximal 1/3 will form the primitive right ventricle, whereas the primitive ventricle, this yellow portion, will form the primitive left ventricle. I will repeat myself, the bulboventricular loop will form as the bulbus cordis will merge into the primitive ventricle, and together they will form the ventricles. The bulbus cordis portion will convert into the primitive right ventricle, whereas the primitive ventricle will convert into the primitive left ventricle, but the trabeculated part. Now the atrium and the sinus venosus. What will happen over here? Now you will see here, okay, the ventricle and the atrium, they are also separated by a groove which is called as the atrioventricular groove, and this atrioventricular groove will appear as the coronary sulcus, which will be separating the atria from the ventricles. This primitive atrium will be converted. What will happen to this portion? From the atrium, this atrium portion, the venous portion, it will go up over here, right, towards the dorsal aspect of the atrial end of this heart tube, and this primitive atrium will be partitioned to form right and left atria. Now what happens with the sinus, this sinus venosus? The sinus venosus has one body and it has two horns, as you can see, a right horn and a left horn. The right horn of the sinus venosus is absorbed into the right atrium. Now you should know that this sinus venosus will contribute with the atrium and form its parts, right? So what happens in the right atrium, the sinus venosus will form will be absorbed into the right atrium, along with the right common cardinal vein, which will contribute in the formation of the superior vena cava, the right umbilical vein, which will disappear eventually, and the right vitelline vein, which will form the part of the inferior vena cava. Now, the right horn of the sinus venosus, which was absorbed into the right atrium, which was previously derived from the primitive atrium, will contribute in the formation of the openings of superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava into the right atrium. Now, what about the left horn of the sinus venosus? In the left horn of the sinus venosus, it regresses, and the remnant will form part of the coronary sinus. The coronary sinus marks the lower boundary of the base of the heart. You should remember that. Above it are present the atria and majorly the left atrium. Whereas the body of the sinus venosus gets absorbed into the right atrium and forms its smooth part. Right? In a way, you can say that major portion of the right atrium is derived from the sinus venosus, whereas the major portion of the left atrium is derived from the primitive atrium. I hope that you have understood the anatomy of the heart by the very primordial structure, or the basic structure in its development, and in this way you can understand it. Thank you.